like The Mandalorian. Take a show like The Mandalorian. Already you have kind of like actors basically walking in these rooms that are just huge, like the walls are just OLED screens. And everything that's in the world around them is just being kind of produced, right? Like they're not, you don't have to film in a desert anymore. It looks better if you film them in a big, basically big like room that's just coated in OLED kind of monitors, right? You know, in some deep sense, you know, you could think within a few years, all right, the entire you know, like if you ask an AI, take this book and produce a first shot movie script from this, trivial, okay? Because that's compression, right? That's taking a lot of information that's already in the book and just kind of like morphing it into a new form and actually producing, in some sense, less information that's in the whole thing, right? Producing the backdrop, you know, behind the actor, you know, where people are going to be like kind of real actors are going to be interacting in the front. Trivial, right? Like you can do that, like, you know, from really, really simple descriptions, right? You know, what it's not going to be able to do, right? What it still seems like is going to be really, really far off, right? Is any task where in some deep sense what you need is a rich world model, right? Like you know, like it's not gonna, I'm a huge Christopher Nolan fan, right? It's not going to be able to replace, in some deep sense, like, you know, anyone who has to ask a question like this story, like, you know, what is psychologically rich and interesting about this? And what, like, small perturbation of our real world would make this particularly interesting to people who actually have, like, a real human model of this world. And so, you know, in some deep sense, it's like the people who are going to win tremendously from it, well, first of all, the whole industry becomes, you know, infinitely more productive. But, you know, the real winners are people who have that, you know, who really, really have that deep world model. Because in some deep sense, like everything that doesn't require that deep world model is going to become completely trivial. And anything that requires that deep world model and is a complement in kind of producing kind of these interesting kind of things to you know, kind of automated tasks that don't require the world model are going to be I don't have a lot of time, right? So we have like
15.
I have 15? Okay. I was gonna talk, I could talk a little bit about like what firms, let me skip past this for a second because maybe I can come back to this. Like, other amazing things that, like, you know, this actually was just from this week. You know, new generative, like big changes that are coming, new generative models. You know, again, like, I think you go into this kind of industry if you were a huge science fiction fan when you were a kid. You know, one cool, besides transporters, which are the coolest technology, the second coolest technology, you know, from Star Trek, okay, maybe phasers, but the universal translator. These pins you put on your lapel, and you can just talk with anything, anyone, any kind of species. Just this week, you know, kind of, you know, generative AI model, you know, Facebook / Meta, now we're supposed to call it, shows this amazing, you know, shows this amazingly advanced kind of thing. Actually, would you play the left video? I won't even split.
So glad you're here. I am so happy to see you. Me alegra mucho que estés aquí. Me alegra mucho verte.
So that the first part of that clip was the person speaking in English. The second part of the clip was an AI attempting to translate what that person said into Spanish, matching their voice, matching their tone, and matching the emotive mood of what they're saying. Okay? Like Google Translate has already been great. It's great for years at taking text, right? Like one of my favorite authors, Haruki Murakami, like, you know, writes in Japanese and has this like effectively professional translator, Jay Rubin, who has spent his life trying to say like, well, what should Haruki Murakami feel like in English? And like translate his books into English. We all read, in some sense, Jay Rubin's compression of Murakami, not like Murakami, if you're reading it in English, right? You know, with like already 4 years ago, if you were to randomly show people Google Translate's translation of Haruki Murakami, 2 times out of, not to insult Jay Rubin, 2 times out of 3 people prefer to Jay Rubin's translation. Okay? The real advance here is that it's starting to get better at just in real time taking what you're saying and just basically transforming your voice and your mode of tone into a different language, right? And like spoken. You can see, can you play the right hand one? She's whispering. It's good. Maybe that video was too quiet to hear, but you know, so think about like you know, the advantages, you know, kind of that Zoom is already kind of bringing us in terms of kind of being able to communicate across great distances. Now imagine that you can like Zoom with anybody in the world, no matter what language they're speaking, with effectively zero latency. Like they see you speaking Japanese and you see them speaking English, and it just feels, you know, completely natural. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about kind of, you know, big changes then that we can see kind of coming. This was a project that I was on the kind of planning committee and they headed up before it failed for various reasons. We had to sell it. But kind of, you know, for a long time at Uber, we had to think hard about, well, you know, self-driving technology is getting better at a very fast pace. It didn't get better as fast as we had hoped, okay? But how do we think about kind of obviously having to pivot our core business model away from being a two-sided platform where we don't own the cars and we just connect kind of human drivers with human riders and help them kind of like interact with each other, which we were already using a tremendous amount of AI to kind of help mediate that interaction, to a slightly different model where what will probably have to become the case is that it would be efficient for us to own the cars, because these cars are quite expensive, right? That's like a $200,000 SUV where over half the cost is just like the equipment on the roof, right? And in some sense, let's replace an extremely low fixed cost but high marginal cost technology for providing rides. That is like the human driver brings their car, but they cost Uber, say like roughly kind of $2 or $3 a mile to produce a trip, with a very high fixed cost but extremely low marginal cost technology for providing rides. This $200,000 car would then cost like 15 cents a mile to provide rides. Okay. This is not this is not reality. Like I said, like within the last month, this turned on all for the entirety of LA. Anyone here, if you want, you can download Waymo, right, the app, and a car will arrive with nobody in the front seat. It's quite eerie. Okay. And it'll drive you to it'll drive you to wherever you want to go, take you to the restaurant in downtown LA. Okay. Let me say, like, in terms of like thinking about what that disrupts, many of you probably already have. Okay, so this is the kind of ride hailing is kind of in some sense the closest and easiest to experience kind of way that this may change the way that kind of we get around cities, that we kind of like move around the world. What is the potential impact of that? I mean, 40,000 people a year in the United States die in motor vehicle accidents. If this is even, when this, Waymo is currently, kind of already at a point where it's probably about twice as safe as that, right? So that's alone like 20,000 people in the United States next year, if this kind of technology becomes quite widespread, that don't die. That's a pretty big thing. But tell you the truth, I think the larger and almost immediate impact is, whereas this technology is still kind of, like we said, like, 78% of radiologists, where this technology is already, still maybe about like the 60th, 80th, somewhere between the 60th and 80th percentile of human drivers. This technology, like putting fully autonomous kind of large distance shipping trucks, that's already basically at the 100th percent of human ability. Why? Because driving on a highway is a much simpler problem than driving on a city. And the thing that causes failures amongst human drivers is not like some complex reasoning task. It's like falling asleep or losing attention, right? Like a human driver just has a hard time like doing this task. You know, the 14th hour they've been doing it, like, you know, on the road, okay? But being able to replace that with like, you know, you put $100,000 on an SUV, right? That's a big kind of change. These trucks are already super expensive. You know, putting $100,000 worth of technology on one of these trucks, maybe keeping the human driver inside, but letting them be kind of doing kind of, you know, logistics, kind of, you know, planning routes, you know, like, you know, working through packages and kind of thinking through things in the back. That's already an extremely kind of cost-effective kind of technology. How do you think about that as kind of displacing? Well, the political economy of that is pretty bad. Let me give you kind of an example of this. So this is like, you know, from the Census ACS data. What I'm showing you here is a map of the United States, where what I've just placed on top of every state is in the US Census, what is the most common job of somebody who lives in that state, right? Yeah, there's a couple of interesting things that jump out here. Washington, D.C. is the only place where lawyer is like the most common job. Utah, it turns out, is like remarkably full of software developers. Alaska, maybe that's as far as primary school teachers, right? In like the Northeast, like there's a lot of that too. There's aging states with like nursing aides are kind of like the most common thing. But what's interesting here is that the vast majority of the landmass, and in fact the vast majority of the electoral college votes in the United States, the most common job in those areas is truck driver. Okay, so if you want to think about like the most immediately politically fraught or shocking kind of impact of AI is what happens if within the next 5 years, like that job just ends, right? Like it no longer makes sense for a human to do that, right? What political effect does that have? What impact does that have on kind of like how accepting people are going to be of the technology? Yeah, that's what I think is kind of, that's probably like, from a political economic perspective, like the largest impact of AI within the next kind of like few years. Okay, let me say like, what are, maybe I could take questions, or I could, like, I was gonna get 5 minutes. Okay, I think 5 minutes is already too little to take questions. Yeah, thank you guys very much. I'm happy to take questions for any questions for you?
I've always had a question that, should the government play any role in the regulations of AI? Because the more the AI, the more it will replace human beings, and the more the unemployment will be there in the country. So should the government play any role in this?
Well, okay, so it's an interesting question. I think there's a couple of potentially important roles for government regulation here, right? I think the most obvious is going to be, and I think the thing that a lot of attention is being paid to is the worry of kind of like misinformation and just like rapid transformations of our information channels. Okay, like a lot of this is kind of nerdy, but a lot of software developers basically say, well, now that we let people just watch videos like crazy, right? Like this is like, oh, whatever you want, and it seems perfectly natural. Like pull up a video on your phone and just kind of watch it. But we don't let computers. We understand that it's incredibly dangerous if you let any computer just immediately download software that that's been completely unverified and just run it. But in some sense, like when you watch these videos, you're kind of running software that somebody else wrote without checking it on your own brain, right? And then the question is like, as the technology for like really understanding how that kind of affects human cognition, what it impresses you with, and kind of stuff like this, I think there is going to be a tremendous amount of deep, hard thinking about what if we can basically kind of really, really train AIs to understand like what is very kind of gripping to the human mind, right? Like what is like, you know, what maximizes engagement, and then we kind of unleash that, and you know, because of generative models, like the kind of production cycle of that and the iteration cycle of that becomes just kind of trivial. That's obviously going to be like something we have to think hard about. What I just talked about in terms of kind of labor, you know, traditionally economists think, well, we should, you know, all of the, in every previous epoch, kind of, you know, major technological advances create more jobs than they destroy, because, you know, the degree to which everybody becomes just increasingly more productive, because the things that we're good at are just complements to the things that technology happens. So in some sense, it's a whole labor augmenting technology, suggests that we really shouldn't try and hold back kind of the development, or, you know, really, you know, trying to do that. I think that's also true of this technology, right, kind of AI, kind of like I just said. On the other hand, like the possibility of incredibly rapid displacement may be something that we need to think hard about. Like I said, like if over 5/6 of the US landmass like is suddenly going to experience kind of, you know, the main job that people do in those regions, like just disappears, like that's pretty disruptive. And it's important to kind of maybe think that through. Yeah, other questions?
So the jobs that you showed on the map, displacing trucks, truck drivers, and retail, are pretty rudimentary, kind of go and
Yeah.
just do. What about business decisions and staffs, legions and legions of staff that prepare all of the staff work with pros and cons and research and everything? When on the curve does AI be in a position to ask the right questions?
When does AI? Well, okay. So one way to think about your question is we perhaps have never experienced, like, you know, the display. You know, the U.S. produces, you know, 6 times more food, you know, than we did kind of 100 years ago, but we employ like 20% of the workforce doing it, right? Like, so, you know, we're kind of used to somewhat more routine tasks being displaced, right? What happens when like there's no longer a thing called a radiologist, right? Or no longer, you know, like various kinds of what we used to think of as relatively high skilled jobs, like you know, lawyers. What happens if like basically it's just done, like that, you know, certainly like paralegal, right? Like what happens when that's basically over? You know, like, I mean, I think in some sense what we're experiencing already, what a lot of us are experiencing with ChatGPT and kind of generative models and you know, their rapid kind of advance, Sora kind of examples of this, is we're learning a lot more maybe uncomfortable facts about what things that like we've been doing all along that in some deep sense are not that hard, like are basically just like summarizing a whole bunch of stuff that, you know, without really having to understand it very deeply, summarizing a whole bunch of stuff that you've just kind of like
Spreadsheets.
been asked to read, comb through, I mean, I think the way to think about the future is we're going to have to grapple with that answer to that, the potentially quite uncomfortable answer to that question, like very quickly, very soon, because yeah, like it's going to be inescapable. Like what you're doing, like, can easily be done by a chip no more powerful than what you carry in your smartphone, and you know, 200 times faster than you can do it.
But will the AI be able to look at situations for a company and say, what are the critical business decisions that we have to confront operationally, strategically, etc.?
It's almost impossible to answer that question fully, but what you should think is which of those decisions that like we think about like high level decision makers and firms having to make actually are quite in some sense routine, and which of those decisions are actually like quite difficult. And you know, we have intuitions about that. The answer will become obvious quickly.
Okay, Keith, we could go on and on.
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.